Star Trek aired in 1966 and featured the first interracial kiss ever depicted on American television, while also spotlighting a crew that featured a Russian navigator, a Japanese helmsman, an African comms officer, and a Scottish engineer. Just think about that. By comparison, consider how, in 2006, the rom-com Hitch cast Ava Mendes as the female romantic lead opposite Will Smith, because studio executives at the time were reportedly not confident that audiences would accept a black man and a white woman as an on-screen couple. So they decided to cast a Latina woman. And yet Star Trek went out of its way to feature that interracial kiss between a white man and a black woman 40 years prior. Do you see what I mean? For many people, nerddom was always the place where one could escape the regressive tendencies of more mainstream fare.
Agent Cooper, Agent Bryson's here to see you.
Send him right in.
Coop. Dennis?
It's a long story, but actually I prefer Denise, if you don't mind.
Okay.
That was 1991. Not only did Twin Peaks have a transgender character played by David Duchovny, it had major roles for an indigenous character played by Michael Horse and a Chinese character played by Joan Chen. And these characters are woven so organically into the world of the story that the storytellers don't miss a beat in including them. It just made sense, and they were included not to fill a diversity quota, but because they were viewed as organic ingredients of the world of Twin Peaks. I would also like to mention that Deep Space Nine is my favorite incarnation of Star Trek, and how could I fail to include Dr. Bashir, played by Alexander Siddig, or Siddig El Fadil as he was credited at the time, as an example of a diverse character from the 90s who was organically part of the crew. And that character served under Captain Benjamin Sisko, one of 3 generations of Siskos that we got to meet over the 7 seasons of that show. If I haven't convinced you yet, then count the straight white men in the following list: Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, Susanna Clarke, Robin Hobb, Anne McCaffrey, Diana Wynne Jones, Mercedes Lackey, Samuel Delaney, Isabel Allende, Sarah Douglas, Clive Barker, R.A. Salvatore. How many of these are household names? Yet, if you're a sci-fi nerd and an avid reader, you probably know the majority of those names. God, you probably also know that one of the earliest science fiction books ever written was Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley. I mean, Jennifer Lawrence made the claim recently that nobody had ever put a woman in the lead of an action movie before, until she starred in the Hunger Games.
I remember when I was doing Hunger Games, nobody had ever put a woman in the lead of an action movie because it wouldn't work. We were told girls and boys can both identify with a male lead, but boys cannot identify with a female lead.
Now, she's been dragged through the coals for this ignorant statement, so there's no need to dogpile on her anymore here. In all likelihood, she was coached to say that verbatim. Let's instead consider that what she probably could have said there, to have a bit more credibility, is that action films with women in the lead roles have traditionally sat a little bit outside of the mainstream, so normies or casuals might not be typically aware of them. Take the Resident Evil films, or Ultraviolet, starring Mila Jovovich, for example. Those are niche nerd movies for a small contingent of moviegoers. Same with Tomb Raider. And Xena Warrior Princess is definitely swords and sandals genre fare, not mainstream. Elektra is a comic book movie from back before the MCU began, while Aeon Flux is based on an early 90s animated TV show. Kate Beckinsale is widely understood to have kicked some serious ass in the Underworld movies, but that's werewolf versus vampire genre fare. Alien and Aliens, The Terminator and Terminator 2, all science fiction. Kill Bill is a martial arts film, enjoyable for the mainstream, certainly, but far more enjoyable for those well-versed in martial arts film history. And I would be remiss if I did not bring up the work of Gina Davis, who has starred in a great many iconic roles, including leading the cast of Cutthroat Island. All of these movies happened. All of this stuff that modern mainstream Hollywood is claiming never happened before, it all did happen. Quite a lot, actually. But all of it fell, to varying degrees, outside of the mainstream. And it was all enjoyed, primarily, by nerds. Like, seriously, do you think that Jennifer Lawrence remembers this scene from the very first Star Wars movie?
What the hell are you doing?
Somebody has to save our skins. Into the garbage, you flyboy!
And let's go back to Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl for 1 second. Because while that movie does begin with a pretty typical scenario of the male heroes embarking on a quest to rescue the female love interest from kidnappers, the script flips the formula halfway through. Midway through the film, Elizabeth Swann rescues herself by building a smoke signal while Jack Sparrow lies drunk and useless on a beach. And by the film's end, it is Elizabeth who is rescuing her male love interest, Will Turner, from the clutches of the evil pirates. And the Pirates of the Caribbean film series takes it even further. By the third movie, At World's End, Elizabeth Swann is crowned Pirate King of the Brethren Court.
No, they will see free men! And freedom! And what the enemy will see is the flash of our cannons. They will hear the ring of our swords, and they will know what we can do! Gentlemen, hoist the colors.
So there you have it. Nerddom has always presented a relief from traditional, regressive, or rigid gender roles. Do you see why it boils my blood? You could say all that stuff was niche before, but the claim that it didn't happen at all just feeds this emerging view in Hollywood that nerds have been curators of nothing but regressive, immature ideals, rather than the custodians of genre fare and speculative fiction, which is my personal definition of the term nerd. And then to hear normies picking it up and spreading those ideas, it just makes me sad. But beyond that, it concerns me. I was personally rather gutted to hear someone recently say to me offhandedly, "Oh, wasn't J.R.R. Tolkien known for being super racist?" That hurts, because the narrative of Tolkien or Lord of the Rings being racist is clearly manufactured artificially by people who are not fans of Lord of the Rings, and it puts anyone who is a fan of Lord of the Rings, who happens to not be white, like yours truly, in a really weird position of having to explain that they're not a self-hating geek with internalized racism, but that Lord of the Rings quite simply has true universal appeal that knows no boundaries of color or creed. If you're still struggling with this notion, consider the following idea, that to view the orcs and Uruk-hai in Lord of the Rings as racist caricatures, one has to believe that people with darker skin wouldn't find those orcs and Uruk-hai, as they are depicted on screen, to be equally as grotesque and terrifying as white people find them. Lord of the Rings, and more broadly the Middle-earth saga, at large, is by design a myth cycle for the British people, whom Tolkien saw as lacking a myth cycle. In this letter written by Tolkien to his publisher Milton Waldman in 1951, the following quote can be found. "Do not laugh, but once upon a time my crest has long since fallen. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain, and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic. And since some on the internet might have the instinct here to write all of that off as being the product of white privilege, it behooves me to remind the viewer that being a white male in Tolkien's time meant being conscripted by the British armed forces and sent to die on the front lines of World War I, a conflict in which the most effective weapon held by either side was the wave of human bodies. Tolkien reflects upon this experience in the foreword to the second edition of The Fellowship of the Ring, writing, "One has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel fully its oppression. But as the years go by, it seems now often forgotten that to be caught in youth by 1914 was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years. By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead." So, please, let's not go accusing Tolkien of having white privilege. If in your youth you were never conscripted, never sent to the front lines of a war of attrition in some of the most brutal circumstances imaginable, even to this day, if you've never seen your homeland ravaged by a war that you neither asked for nor understood, then no matter how dark your skin is, and no matter how much of an oppressed minority you might identify as, you are, in all likelihood, far more privileged than J.R.R. Tolkien ever was. Now, a warning. The following images are highly upsetting, like genuinely upsetting. Sensitive viewers may wish to avert their eyes or skip ahead by about a minute. This is World War I. It's 2024 now, and the dead soldiers shown in these pictures have been dead for over 100 years. Tolkien could easily have been one of those bodies. And certain people, mainly, in my opinion, academics who like to go on and on about white privilege, I think they need to be reminded that this is what white privilege looked like in Europe in the 1910s. World War I was unspeakably, soul-shakingly horrible. And it is also most likely the main reason why we have The Lord of the Rings as a work of literature. J.R.R. Tolkien was a conscripted combat veteran who saw action in the Battle of the Somme, until he came down with trench fever and was sent home in October of 1916. Let's be clear on this. Like so many men of his generation, Tolkien was sent to fight and die for England. He was a young man suffering in the trenches of World War I, pining for the beauty and comfort of his home. Why on earth should anyone have a problem with someone like that deciding to write a story that is, in its essence, English? in what it depicts and celebrates. Seriously, what kind of story do you think would have cooked up in Tolkien's soul then? Not a story for the modern racially diverse landscape of modern California. No. From the crucible of World War I combat, Tolkien began to imagine Middle-earth, which, as I have outlined above, is a story for England, for the country he was fighting for and the land he was desperate to return to. Seriously, check out Tolkien's response to Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer in this letter from 1967. I'll start with this little passage in which Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer provide an annotation which reads, Middle-earth corresponds spiritually to Nordic Europe. Tolkien's response is a vociferous rejection of such a term. The professor writes, not Nordic, please. A word I personally dislike. It is associated, though of French origin, with racialist theories. Geographically, northern is usually better. But examination will show that even this is inapplicable geographically or spiritually to Middle-earth. And then a little further down, we find this passage. Auden has asserted, Tolkien writes, that for me, the north is a sacred direction. That is not true. The northwest of Europe, where I and most of my ancestors have lived, has my affection, as a man's home should. I love its atmosphere, and know more of its histories and languages than I do of other pans. But it is not sacred, nor does it exhaust my affections. I have, for instance, a particular love for the Latin language, and among its descendants, for Spanish. That it is untrue for my story, a mere reading of the synopses should show. The North was the seat of the fortresses of the devil. I can't imagine a more formative experience for a young man than fighting in World War I. And so for Tolkien, I think it's safe to assume that the terrible other, the dark enemy, was the German armed forces. Not people of color in a general sense, as so many academics love to argue. The German soldiers would have been the ones who Tolkien saw as dark, shadowy figures of evil, gas-masked up and deploying fumes of death. Truly a dark other, if ever there was one. In the 1930s, Tolkien found himself pressured to identify himself as Aryan by a German publisher, Rutten and Loning. And this was Tolkien's response. In 1938, a year in which, I don't have to remind anyone, the Third Reich was actively sending Jewish people to the concentration camps. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian, Tolkien writes. But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. So here's my question to the academics who feel so intent on labeling Tolkien as racist. Do they actually think they're helping people of color by doing this? Honestly, I think that people who leap to these sorts of conclusions are not very well versed in world literature in general. And I'm sorry if I come across as a little pretentious here, but do we consider it a failing of Gabriel Garcia Marquez for depicting a cast of characters that is entirely Colombian in his novel 100 Years of Solitude? Is a movie like Hero required to feature a single character who is not Chinese? Did we consider it offensive that Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite is one of the least diverse movies from 2019, but also, in my opinion, one of the best? No, it's not offensive to fail to include everyone else in the world. And that is not tantamount to racism. As scholar Dimitra Fimi writes in her book Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, From Fairies to Hobbits, it should be self-evident that it is very problematic to pursue such questions in Tolkien's work, since they could only be treated within the framework of modern perspectives on racism and racial discrimination. The reason that The Lord of the Rings is so cherished all around the world by all kinds of people with all kinds of skin colors and ethnic backgrounds is because any audience member can see themselves in the main characters. You don't have to be a white male to identify with Frodo and Sam's struggles and take strength from their strength. Because honestly, when it comes to those of us who love the Lord of the Rings films, we all already do feel represented on screen. Whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're African or European or Asian or anything else, we're all included. And that's not because Frodo and Sam look like us. It's because their struggle resonates with us. Each of us has been, or will be, at some point required to throw the One Ring into the fires of Mordor. That trial will look different for every individual, and when it happens to you, you might have to face it down completely in private. Whether it's recovering from a devastating car crash, kicking a debilitating drug addiction, or getting diagnosed with a terrible disease, or even getting stranded and having to walk 20 miles home in a snowstorm, even facing down a terrifying exam or a brutal day at work, at some point, you will be required to get something done that seems totally impossible and beyond your ability to handle. None of us, dear viewer, none of us get to escape this. And that's what The Lord of the Rings is, and does. We won't all, like J.R.R. Tolkien, be deployed to the front lines of World War I. We won't all lose all of our friends by our mid-20s. But we will all come to moments in our lives when we will feel like Frodo, or like Sam, or like Aragorn, or Boromir, or Theoden, or Faramir, or Gandalf. And when those moments hit, well, at least personally, I can say that it's the words of Tolkien that spring to mind most readily, and bring me the most strength when I most need it. Moments like these.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil.
If I were a knight of Rohan, capable of great deeds, but I'm not. I'm a hobbit, and I know I can't save Middle-earth. I just want to help my friends.
It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing. The shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going. So sorry.
This task was appointed to you, Frodo of the Shire. If you do not find a way, no one will.
I can see him with my waking eyes. Then let us be rid of it. Once and for all. Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you. But I can carry you!
So much death. What can men do against such reckless hate?
Ride out with me. Ride out and meet them.
For death and glory.
For Rohan. For your people.
Legolas, get them out. Give them a moment, for pity's sake. By nightfall, these hills will be swarming with orcs. We must reach the woods of Lothlorien. Come, Boromir, Legolas, Gimli, get them out.
On your feet, Sam.
I thought up an ending for my book. And he lived happily ever after. To the end of his days.
And I'm sure you will, my dear friend.
And now the powers that be in the entertainment world seem to be trying to convince people that no, this golden standard of art and entertainment from the early 2000s is only for white people. If you're a person of color, you're not supposed to be satisfied with this stuff. You have to see people who look exactly like you on screen to be able to fully relate to the story and feel its full resonance. That's just exactly the opposite of what I have always held storytelling to be about, which is to show the inherent universality present in specific, unique, individual experiences. The point isn't to gatekeep the richness of life itself. Besides, just consider what Lord of the Rings would be like if the different races were assigned to different colors. I suppose that's what academics often assume or presume about Tolkien's Middle-earth. But I beg to differ, seriously. Imagine if elves were white, dwarves were brown, men were black, and hobbits were Asian. Just imagine that. Well, in Middle-earth, being an elf is just better. You get to be immortal, wisest and fairest of all, and at the end of everything, you get to sail away to Valinor. The dwarves are awesome, but being master of a mountain hall is not quite as cool as being immortal, wisest, and fairest of all beings, is it? No, no, no! Modern pop culture's obsession with race has nothing to do with Lord of the Rings. That's not what Tolkien ever intended. It's all a myth of England, like the matter of Britain. Hobbits, dwarves, elves, and men, they're all English. But that doesn't mean you can't love Lord of the Rings if you're not English. You can love it just as fully as someone of the exact same origin as J.R.R. Tolkien, even if you're from the other side of the planet. So, instead of faulting Lord of the Rings for being exclusively about white people, why not celebrate the fact that, given that Lord of the Rings is written by and for white people, the whole world still gets to participate in it? Or maybe I'm just a racist. Also, again, I'm not even fucking white. But, never mind. Actually, on that subject, I honestly didn't mind that the Rings of Power had a bunch of people of color playing roles like dwarves and elves. What I did mind was how they did it. I minded how low quality the show was, how insulting I found the script writing, how unlikable and shallow the characters were, how incoherent the plot was, how it failed to achieve even a spark of that special feeling conjured by Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Here are a few examples.
Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? Because the stone sees only downward. The darkness of the water is vast and irresistible. The ship feels the darkness as well, striving moment by moment to master her and pull her under. But the ship has a secret. For unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward but up, fixed upon the light that guides her, whispering of grander things than darkness ever knew.
That, my friends, is pseudo-philosophy, and it is a far cry from the actual philosophy found in Lord of the Rings.
It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance.
Pity? It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment.
Or what about this depiction of the Lady Galadriel that the Rings of Power offers us?
There are many ways to kill an orc. But for you, I will keep it strong and simple. Stab, twist, gut.
After all you have endured, it is only natural to feel conflicted.
Conflicted? I am grateful you have not known evil as I have. But you have not seen what I've seen.
I have seen my share.
You have not seen what I have seen.
Amazon wants me to believe that that is the same character, that is the same order of being as Galadriel as we see her in The Lord of the Rings?
This task was appointed to you, Frodo of the Shire. If you do not find a way, no one will.
And then this was just disrespectful.
For centuries they have swept across crag and crevice, washing away the last remnants of our enemy, like a spring rain over the bones of a dead animal.
The Council regrets to inform you, you won't be permitted to attend the next session. Elf Lords only.
I think you talk too much. And you smell of rotten leaves.
But what I disliked, more than I disliked the show itself, was how the showrunners seemed to be unable to consider the possibility that many Lord of the Rings fans simply didn't like the show. So Amazon turned to the fairly predictable modern trope of blaming, yep, you guessed it, racism. Check out how The Hollywood Reporter paints it in this article. Here, J.D. Payne, one of the Rings of Power showrunners, is quoted as saying the following: "Even if you're fighting for something you think is good, if you do something worse in that fight, then you become evil. I don't see how people who are saying these things think that they're fighting for good. It's patently evil." But in that very same article, a fan is quoted as writing the following: "I'm tired of the constant media harangues from Amazon that if you don't love the show, you're racist." All the waves of negative reviews, the Rings of Power showrunners just couldn't fathom that most of those negative reviews were justified, because viewers of the show were easily able to see past the pretty, glittery sheen to the lazy, shallow, amateurish writing and performances lurking just beneath the surface.
Keep it strong and simple. Stab, twist, gut.
I mean, these are Tolkien fans we're talking about. Remember the words of Tolkien? All that is gold does not glitter. I mean, did the Rings of Power showrunners even read the books? It's like Amazon thought that with $1 billion budget, there was no way Lord of the Rings fans wouldn't like the show. They thought we were easily bought, like professional critics are. Because they thought our reasons for loving Lord of the Rings before this were shallow reasons. It's as if they said, Lord of the Rings fans only like big battles and spectacle, right? So we'll give them big battles and spectacle and they can't possibly dislike it, right? And if they do dislike it, that's just bad faith criticism shielding a deeper seething core of secret racism. Because fantasy nerds are shallow, right? Dragons and castles and battles, that's all they like, isn't it? Given such an assumption of shallowness, which is in itself a shallow thing to think, it makes sense, doesn't it? That Amazon and the Rings of Power production team would be incapable of understanding a negative backlash to the show as anything other than racism, either overt or disguised. Yeah, given all of that, Rings of Power is just not for me, thanks. I found the show to be poorly written, poorly acted, safe, modern to a fault, derivative, generic, cringy, and disrespectful. It's just not good enough for me. I take my high fantasy raw, cutting edge, challenging, deep, and emotionally impactful. Like House of the Dragon. I'll take that kind of show any day over the level of disrespect to their audience and source material that Amazon brought to the table. Plus, the critical success of House of the Dragon amongst Game of Thrones fans just proves untrue the idea that racism is the reason for the Rings of Power's lack of critical success amongst Tolkien fans. Because House of the Dragon featured people of color too. The entirety of House Velaryon was cast as African, and the White Worm was portrayed by Japanese actress Sonoya Mizuno. Yet, unlike the Rings of Power, House of the Dragon was embraced by its fandom. And why was that? In my opinion, the simple answer is that House of the Dragon clearly put a lot of love into its production. The writing and the acting was absolutely mind-blowing. And to be honest, race-swapping House Velaryon and House of the Dragon was a brilliant choice, injecting a bit of racially charged intensity into the matter of the succession of Driftmark, a major plot point in the show's first season.
You break law and centuries of tradition to install your daughter as heir. Yet you dare tell me who deserves to inherit the name Velaryon. That is no true Velaryon. And certainly no nephew of mine. You may run your house as you see fit, but you will not decide the future of mine.
Plus, the Velaryons just looked cool. They looked like they truly belonged in the world of Westeros, even though we had never seen anything like them before in the 8 seasons of Game of Thrones. Overall, the creative choice to portray House Velaryon as African seemed well-considered, bold, powerful, and resonant, and yes, inclusive. The people of color in Rings of Power, by comparison, did not seem permitted by the show to rise above the trappings of modern stereotypes of people of color. So we've got a black elf, but instead of having long hair like all of Tolkien's elves do, he's got a crew cut, which separates him from all other elves. And then the show puts him in chains. Is that a bit of contemporary symbolism, reflecting the racial tension found in the modern day in the United States? Or is it a total failure at achieving escapism? Plus, we've got a black dwarf queen, but she just looks like a modern woman wearing makeup in cosplay. We've got the Harfoots, cousins of hobbits, featuring pseudo-Irish accents that are totally decried by Irish viewers as brutally stereotypical. Besides that, with Rings of Power, you had showrunners and stars taking the attitude that they were fixing Tolkien, telling you that this story that you love, this myth cycle, is racist, and that they have come along now to fix it, updating it for modern audiences in a way that Tolkien never could have.
You know, suddenly we're being put in a position where we are able to move forward, you know, and we are seen and we are heard and we are acknowledged as having a right to be here as much as anybody else.
And calling us nerdy fans patently evil online trolls if we didn't like it. But they made it really hard for us to like it. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, elves have long hair. All of them. Except possibly for a couple of female elves, such as Luthien, who is known to have cut her hair short at one point. For a fantasy world to be quote-unquote Tolkienian, elves must all have long hair, and dwarf women have beards.
It's true you don't see many dwarf women. And in fact, they are so alike in voice and appearance that they're often mistaken for dwarf men. It's the beard.
They had a chance to show something truly unique, and instead, all Amazon gave us in the Rings of Power was this.
Because the stone sees only downward.
Stab, twist, gut, conflicted.
And the accusation of bigotry if you didn't like it. It didn't work for me. I thought it was bad fan fiction.